President Trump says he wants to withhold money from the Postal Service so it can't handle expanded mail-in voting. Let's look at what that means in our state that votes almost entirely by mail. Now, drop boxes are one way for voters to avoid the president's promised sabotage of expanded mail-in voting. But how about rural Colorado, where the drive to a drop box can be a long one? A dangerous new fire is added to the map of fires burning across this dry state. Another Aurora Police Department asked not to be confused with the troubled one of the same name here. And you are solving the mystery of the unidentified waterfall with the help of a guy who has an unusual job. That's next. President Trump today openly threatened the way that Colorado conducts its safe and fair elections, by mail. The president admitted that he wants to block funding for the Postal Service to keep it from being able to handle a wave of mail-in ballots from people who presumably don't want to vote in person during the pandemic. Colorado, of course, depends on a funded and functional Postal Service for our all-mail elections. Our Mark Salinger looks into the president's threat and its possible impact on voting in Colorado.
If they do this...
When President Trump says he wants to withhold funding from the Postal Service, the obvious question for those of us who live in a state where 93% of voters vote by mail is what's going to happen to my ballot.
The president is saying that he is trying to defund the United States Postal Service to prevent Americans from voting.
While Colorado Secretary of State Jenna Griswold calls Trump's plan reprehensible, she points to the protections Colorado has in place to ensure mail-in voting will be safe in November, regardless.
We know how to have accessible elections that are secure.
Colorado is one of a few states that sends a ballot through the mail to every registered voter. Those will be sent out in October, about 3 weeks before Election Day. From there, you have options. You can mail it back, but election officials ask that you do so at least a week before Election Day to make sure it arrives on time. You can also deliver the ballot to a drop box.
Colorado's system works extraordinarily well.
Now remember, this is politics. So while the current Secretary of State, a Democrat, attacks a Republican president...
Yeah, I'm a Republican. It's not a secret.
We also asked former Colorado Secretary of State Wayne Williams for his perspective on what makes Colorado a safe place to vote by mail.
There's a lot of layers, from the voting list to the processes we use to the bipartisan judges.
Only about 2 to 4% of voters are expected to cast their ballots in person this year in Colorado. That's down because of the pandemic, making mail-in voting even more important. The Postal Service says it's confident it has the capacity to handle the surge in election mail. It's a confidence shared by Pam Anderson with the Colorado County Clerks Association, who represents the clerks in charge of sending voters their ballots.
Our Colorado voters should have a lot of confidence in their options, the checks and balances in our system.
And of course, ballots aren't the only thing that the Postal Service delivers. They deliver medicine, paychecks, a million other things. Kyle, as of right now, the Postal Service tells us that mail is not being delayed in Colorado.
This would be a great time, Mark, for the Postal Service in Colorado to come out and just flatly say that they can handle a reduction in funding or whatever else the president wants to pull. Do they have anything to say to you about the president's claims this morning?
Yeah, we reached out to the Postal Service today asking for an interview or a statement, and they responded that they are not going to respond to the president's statements.
All right. Mark Salinger reporting for us from the palatial Salinger estate. Thank you, Mark. While Colorado's ballots all go out by mail, 3/4 of them come back via drop-off boxes. Got that number today from the Secretary of State's office. With President Trump threatening to make it harder for the Postal Service to get mail ballots back and forth from voters, Colorado is looking to add 100 more of the drop boxes. They cost about $10,000 because not only do you have to install them, you have to secure them and provide 24-hour video surveillance. That's in the law. Archuleta County jumped at the state's offer to pay for a new box because right now, that drop-off box in Pagosa Springs, there's only the one in the entire county. Clerk and recorder says that adding another one in Arbolas will help with voter turnout and will help the Archuleta County's 8,600 voters deal with a challenge that's pretty unique to a rural area.
Now they're not having to do the 40-minute drive, which allows them to not have to worry about any wildlife on the road as far as deer and elk. And in November, in the evenings, it's very dangerous for them to have to make that commute.
The state is using federal CARES Act funding to pay for those new drop-off boxes. That's one allowed use of the relief bill to improve election function during the pandemic. There is an aggressive new fire that is burning in the mountains 60 miles west of Fort Collins, and the way that they are talking about this new fire suggests that it could get even worse in a hurry. Very active is the term forest rangers are using to describe the Cameron Peak fire. These are images from Sky 9 a few moments ago. Larimer County Sheriff's Office says that this fire is creating, quote, immediate and imminent danger. They're trying to get people's attention to get out of the area around Chambers Lake. Campgrounds, homes, and businesses are being evacuated up there, and the sheriff is saying that people who are headed out need to head north into Wyoming rather than trying to get around to the Front Range with Highway 14 closed. This new fire is certainly going to stretch firefighting resources in our state because out near Glenwood Springs, the Grizzly Creek fire continues to burn right along I-70. At last check, that's gone through more than 6,200 acres. The interstate is closed indefinitely at this point, and detours right now nearly double the travel time between Denver and Glenwood Springs. And then you got the Pine Gulch fire north of Grand Junction. That is the big one right now. It's burned through more than 100 square miles. That puts it on the map as one of the largest fires ever recorded in Colorado history. Slim Shady is the rapper Eminem. His real name is Marshall. Slick Shady is the name of a new political ad on our air that our own Marshall is putting to the truth test.
We know Slick Shady John Hickenlooper broke ethics laws and took millions in secretive donations.
Yes and no. Yes, as we've covered extensively on Next, Hickenlooper was found to have violated the state's ethics law on 2 trips he took as governor. No, he did not take millions in secretive donations. The National Republican Senatorial Committee tried to get this claim past the goalie in a previous ad that we truth tested, when it focused on one of those donations. Were they secret donations? No. Could you search them out? Yes. Were they easy to find? No. The accounting of those donations, from private companies to the governor's office, can be found on the state's transparency website, which is not very transparent about what the donations were specifically used for.
Colorado's shadiest politician is a tax cheat, too.
Tax cheat is an explosive term. In the end, this claim is muddy. The claim is based on a Channel 7 investigative report from 2010 when Hickenlooper was running for governor. Here's an oversimplified breakdown. In 2000, Hickenlooper and a business partner swapped land with the U.S. Forest Service. The land they got was appraised at one value. 2 years later, Hickenlooper took some of that land and agreed to donate it as part of a conservation easement which would ban development. When he did that, the land was appraised much higher than when he bought it. As part of the conservation easement deal, Hickenlooper received federal tax write-offs and state tax credits on the higher appraisal value. The Colorado Department of Revenue and the IRS started auditing taxpayers concerned about inflated appraisals. 300 tax returns were audited. According to the 2010 Channel 7 investigation, Hickenlooper received a letter from the IRS to resolve the issues related to the conservation easement contribution claimed on his federal income tax for multiple years. The IRS offered Hickenlooper a settlement of $52,486, and he paid it without challenging.
Tax dodger extraordinaire.
This is not true. The tax dodger term implies intent by the person trying to avoid taxes. We asked the NRSC for proof of Hickenlooper's intent, and it could not provide any.
Guess what ad is going to play in the next commercial break? This is the tricky part about truth tests. Ads like this build off of previous ads that we've already truth tested. So you see that once, maybe you see it online, but you continue to see the claims that need context in other ads that air more often than the truth test and then regurgitate something. And then I have to come back on and say it was this or that, but then you're gonna be like, hey, I already heard that. So this is the complicated part of truth tests, is not sounding too repetitive, but also making sure you understand the proper context.
Yeah. Did I hear you cite a Channel 7 investigation here on 9 News? How do you know that works any good?
I one time might have known the people by being inside that building.
All right. I'll take your word for it. All right. I trust you on that one. Thanks, Marshall. Hey, we got some real perspective on what constitutes an actual hardship in the midst of the pandemic, and it came from the Harrison family in Wheat Ridge. While the world hunkered down to avoid COVID-19, that family was in hospitals, welcoming their third baby girl and then getting a devastating diagnosis for their other two daughters the very next day, fatal genetic disease. They shared their story and their determination on Next, and this week they reached back out with a bit of good news. Their oldest daughter, Kinley, has been accepted into a clinical trial. Kinley and her sister Kennedy have a genetic disorder that destroys the nerve cells in their brain and spinal cords. Toxins build up over time and they begin to lose their basic skills. You get one shot at a clinical trial, and Kinley got in directly due to the pandemic. A spot opened up because a family could not come to the U.S. because of travel restrictions, and after seeing the news coverage, Kinley got that clinical trial spot.
While we're excited that Kinley's in this trial, Kennedy still is not, so we're still fighting for her. There's no guarantees that the therapy will work, so we're really still fighting for Kinley as well, and all the other GM1 patients out there.
That clinical trial will take Kinley and her dad, Kyle, to the National Institutes of Health in Maryland for 2 months. Kyle tells us that gene therapy is not likely to bring back the skills that Kinley has lost, but it might put the disease on hold.
The Aurora Police Department is feeling the heat. Not the one here, the one in Illinois.
We just politely tell them that this is the Aurora, Illinois Police Department, and that incident didn't happen here.
And can you identify this waterfall at the center of an old family mystery? About 100 Next viewers think they can, so we went to find an expert on beautiful, out-of-the-way places. Next.
I grew up in a rural county, and there was another Kyle Clark 2 towns over, a kid who had a habit of ending up in the police blotter. And every time that Kyle Clark embarrassed himself publicly, I would cringe and hope that nobody in town thought that it was me that had done whatever he did. And that's how the Aurora, Illinois Police Department feels these days.
So anytime there seems to be some sort of headlines in reference to Aurora, Colorado, we get calls and Facebook messages from all over the country and all over the world. We'll get them from the UK, we'll get them from Canada, Australia, and really all over the US. And we just respond to those and say, this is the Aurora, Illinois Police Department. And usually people apologize and then tell us to have a nice day.
International confusion, sure. You would think that the locals in Illinois would not make this mistake, confusing Colorado's scandal-plagued police department in Aurora for their Aurora Police Department. But apparently no.
Back when the Aurora, Colorado police chief fired some officers, one of the local news stations here, one of the television news stations, mistakenly put our police chief's name throughout that article instead of the Aurora, Colorado police chief's name at that point. And we started to get a ton of telephone calls, a ton of Facebook messages. I immediately reached out to that TV station and they corrected it, apologized to us, but we were already getting phone calls, text messages, social media messages, because people had screenshotted that Facebook post and parts of that article and started sharing them themselves on social media. So that really started just misinformation getting spread on social media.
The folks in Aurora, Illinois tell us they do occasionally exchange information with their counterparts in Aurora, Colorado, typically when a crime tip or a records request comes into the wrong Aurora.
Smoke, haze, and hot highs in the mid-90s, close to a record again today. Ozone alert for poor air quality will be reissued on Friday with temperatures similar to these numbers: 96 in Denver, 100 Lamar, and 90 in Eagle. Not a lot of moisture coming into Colorado, and any of these high-base storms that make it over the foothills, well, they're producing wind and lightning and not the rain that we need. No changes in this pattern until late in the weekend when high pressure begins to bend a little bit, allowing for moisture in. Tomorrow, the focus for strong storms will be outside our forecast area in the Midwest. Partly cloudy, smoky, hazy, and 61 tonight. Back to the mid-90s on Friday, but hey, it is Friday. As a little bit of a cooling trend for Saturday and Sunday with a 30% chance of rain from storms late in the weekend.
So many of you had suggestions about which waterfall is seen in this old photo that's become a bit of a family mystery. But to the viewer who said that it's the waterfall inside Casa Bonita, please stick to the rivers and the lakes that you're used to. Next.
You people love yourselves some waterfalls. About 100 of you wrote in with suggestions on how to solve the mystery offered up by a guy from Nebraska who's looking to identify the waterfall seen in an old vacation photo. He hopes to come back to Colorado to spread his father's ashes at that vacation spot that made them so happy. Of your hundreds of guesses, Treasure Falls near Pagosa Springs was the most popular pick. But a ton of other people are convinced that the photo is actually of Fish Creek Falls in Steamboat. And there were many, many other guesses. We weren't quite sure where to turn on this, so we talked to a guy who scouts locations for movie shoots. He knows scenic spots. Jeff Peterson sent the picture to some of his buddies in the industry, and their consensus was it's Treasure Falls. Jeff, though, not entirely convinced. He thinks that it might be Fish Creek Falls because of the tree line and because of the boulders beneath the falls. And he also had another idea.
The other one that I thought of that's up in the Zirkles, it doesn't really have a name, and if it does, the rangers don't want to tell you, but it's pretty hard to get to. And whereas Fish Creek, you know, for a family on vacation, it's pretty accessible, even back then, I imagined.
So about that super remote waterfall with no name, sure enough, there was a next viewer who suggested that it was, in fact, that remote waterfall in the Zirkles as well. Still not sure on this one. There's a woman who wrote a literal book, Colorado's Best Waterfall Hikes. We've reached out to her, and we'll let you know if she has a verdict. One last note of interest on this. If it turns out that it is Treasure Falls, as so many of you think, that's in a national forest. And rangers told us today that you are not legally allowed to spread someone's ashes there. They asked the people instead plant a memorial tree through the National Forest Foundation. Your feedback is next. Finish with your feedback tonight. Kay writes in about President Trump's comment this morning that he wants to block extra funding to the Postal Service so they can't expand mail-in voting. Kay says, why are you not asking postal union reps, not just the administrators? We did, Kay. We reached out to union officials as well. If anybody out there is inside the Postal Service and wants to tell us what's going on between now and Election Day, you know how to reach us. See you next time.